Something changed in America, and most people felt it but couldn't name it. Not a single moment, not a headline, just a slow creeping feeling that the rules stopped working, that doing everything right stopped being enough. And here's what nobody is saying out loud. That feeling isn't in your head. It's in the data. It's in the numbers being published right now this week. Numbers so significant that historians will be circling them in red ink 50 years from now. The question isn't whether something is wrong. You already know something is wrong. The question is what it actually is. And once you understand what the data is really showing, you won't be able to look at this country the same way again. And the first place to see it isn't in a chart. It's in the faces of the people around you. Think about someone you know well, a friend, a neighbor, a family member, someone whose face you see regularly. Now think about how they seemed 18 months ago and compare that to how they seem now. The person who used to talk about plans now talks about which bills to push back. The person who used to laugh at small frustrations now just absorbs them quietly. The person who used to sleep fine now gets up at 3 in the morning doing math on their phone. The kind they don't want anyone to see. Or think about the guy at the hardware store you've been going to for years. He used to crack a joke when you walked in. Easy. Friendly. Now he just processes the transaction. Doesn't look up. He moves through it the way someone moves through something they've stopped believing in but can't figure out how to leave. Or think about the family at the end of your street whose kids used to leave bikes in the driveway. The house is quiet now. Lights off by 8. You haven't seen them outside in weeks. You've thought about knocking, but you don't because you're not sure what you'd say, and because part of you suspects what they're carrying isn't that different from what you're carrying. 90% of Americans say the country is in a mental health emergency. Say that in a room of 10 people, 9 of them will nod. Half of all American adults report meaningful loneliness, and researchers have found that level of chronic isolation does the same damage to your body as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And this year, 264,000 Americans will die not from illness, not from accidents, but from despair, overdoses, alcohol, suicide. These are not deaths caused by poverty in the traditional sense. These are deaths of people who looked at where their lives were heading and concluded the destination wasn't somewhere they wanted to go. Here's what you need to sit with. Those faces, that weight you recognize in people around you. That's not just a rough economy. That's a symptom of something structural, something building quietly for a long time. And once you understand what it is, you won't be able to unsee it. Here's what's easy to miss. This kind of change doesn't arrive with a warning. It accumulates in numbers updating quietly each week in trends that look manageable right up until they don't, and then the whole picture becomes visible at once. That moment happened this spring. A geopolitical analysis published in May 2026 said something worth sitting with. It said the most durable civilizations tend to begin dying financially long before their populations sense anything irreversible has started. And then it said this decline arrived dressed as normality for years before historians finally admitted what had been happening all along, dressed as normality, because through 2024 and into 2025, the headline numbers looked fine. GDP was growing, the stock market was up. Unemployment sat near 4%. Everything felt slightly worse than the year before, but not differently enough to name. Purchasing power quietly eroding. Stability contracting. Hope for a lot of people quietly draining away. Nothing crossed the line. Nothing gave you a clean moment to point at. And then February 28, 2026, happened. Operation Epic Fury launched that morning. The stated goal was projecting American power into the Persian Gulf, taking out Iran's nuclear program and reasserting control over the most strategically important energy corridor on the planet. What followed was not what the planners modeled. The war closed the Strait of Hormuz. That single waterway moves 21% of the world's daily oil supply. When it closed, Brent crude shot from $67 to a peak of $138. After Israel and Iran exchanged direct missile strikes, it settled at $97. Gas moved from $2.96 nationally to $4.55. In California, it crossed $6.13. Diesel hit a record $6.30s in Chicago. The war costs about $1 billion a day. That is $365 billion a year, added to a deficit already running $2 trillion. On a total national debt already at $39 trillion. with annual interest payments that for the first time in American history crossed $1 trillion in a single year. Now here's the part that should genuinely stop you. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the emergency cushion Congress built specifically after the 1973 OPEC crisis to protect the American economy from exactly this kind of situation, was drawn down at a pace that shattered two consecutive all-time records, 9.92 million barrels in 1 week, and 8.6 million barrels the week before, back-to-back. Both records broken within days of each other. The reserve has been cut roughly in half from its 2009 peak. Over 58 million barrels are gone since February 28th alone. It is now approaching levels not seen since August 1983. Not in months, in days. Cushing, Oklahoma, the physical location where American crude oil is actually priced, lost a third of its inventory in 60 days, dropping from 33 million barrels down to 24.5 million. The operational minimum, the floor below which the pricing mechanism for the entire American oil futures market starts to break down, is approximately 20 million barrels. That leaves a razor-thin 4.5 million barrels of usable inventory. Fortune ran a headline that should have forced emergency hearings in Congress, featuring oil executives, warning prices would spike in weeks as inventories hit unprecedented lows. One senior executive called the situation really, really low levels. The CEO of Saudi Aramco told investors that even if the Strait reopened today, supply normalization would take months, possibly stretching into 2027. One analyst put it simply, great powers rarely collapse from a single defeat. They decline by confusing military capability with strategic judgment. The war meant to show American strength has instead accelerated every dimension of the decline it was supposed to reverse. The immediate arithmetic of the 2026 energy crisis exposes a deeper structural vulnerability, a geographic and economic trap decades in the making. To understand how a single maritime choke point could destabilize the domestic economy in less than 100 days, it is necessary to examine the systematic dismantling of American industrial self-reliance and the parallel growth of the modern globalized supply chain. The architecture of this vulnerability was designed in the late 20th century. Following the structural shocks of the 1970s, American policymakers enacted a series of bilateral trade agreements and regulatory frameworks aimed at minimizing consumer costs through offshore production. Between 1997 and 2024, the United States eliminated over 90,000 manufacturing plants and lost approximately 5 million manufacturing jobs. The foundational assumption of this policy was that the United States could permanently maintain dominance over global maritime trade routes while relying on foreign entities for heavy manufacturing, critical raw materials, and semiconductor fabrication. This strategic pivot transformed the domestic economy into an empire of consumption funded by debt. In 1980, the total U.S. national debt stood at approximately $907 billion, representing roughly 32% of gross domestic product. By the close of 2019, the national debt had expanded to $22.7 trillion. The unprecedented monetary interventions enacted during the disruptions of 2020 through 2022 injected an additional $4.8 trillion into the financial system, accelerating consumer price index inflation to a 40-year high of 9.1% in June 2022. By mid-2026, the cumulative total national debt crossed the $39 trillion threshold, creating a compounding fiscal obligation that requires $1.1 trillion annually just to service the interest payments. The geographic dimensions of this economic framework are inherently unstable. The modern global economy relies on 8 critical maritime choke points: the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb, the Turkish Straits, the Danish Straits, the Strait of Gibraltar, and the Strait of Hormuz. Because American domestic manufacturing has been systematically hollowed out, the daily survival of the population requires the uninterrupted passage of container ships and supertankers through these specific narrow channels. The current operational paralysis at the Strait of Hormuz represents the structural failure of this model. The strait, a hyper-congested corridor measuring only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, with shipping lanes reduced to 2 miles of width in each direction. When maritime transit was suspended following the events of February 28, 2026, the impact on domestic supply networks was immediate. Bypassing the standard lags associated with monetary policy, the energy sector is not the only asset exposed to this geographic trap. The domestic agricultural system, frequently cited as a pillar of American self-sufficiency, is deeply dependent on foreign supply chains. The United States imports over 70% of its potassium-based fertilizers and a substantial portion of its nitrogen and phosphorus inputs from global suppliers. The maritime transport of these chemical components relies on the same choke points currently impacted by ongoing geopolitical confrontations. Consequently, domestic fertilizer costs escalated by 43% between March and June 2026, forcing corporate agricultural operations to alter planting ratios for the upcoming harvest cycle. Furthermore, the technological infrastructure of the United States rests on an even more acute geographic concentration. Over 92% of the world's advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity is located on the island of Taiwan, within direct range of regional kinetic conflict. A standard modern automobile requires over 1,000 separate semiconductor chips to control everything from engine timing to braking systems. The domestic defense industrial base faces identical constraints. A single advanced fighter jet requires hundreds of pounds of specialized rare earth metals, including neodymium and dysprosium, 70% of which are mined and 90% of which are processed by commercial monopolies within the People's Republic of China. The historical trajectory of this decline follows an established economic pattern documented across multiple historical empires. The transition from an empire of production to an empire of financialization alters the underlying incentives of the ruling class. When a state shifts its core economic activity from manufacturing tangible goods to generating complex financial instruments, wealth concentrates rapidly within the financial services sector, while the physical infrastructure supporting the broader populace degrades. The state of the American transportation network in 2026 reflects this decades-long investment deficit. The American Society of Civil Engineers periodically evaluates the nation's infrastructure, consistently registering grades in the near-failing category. Over 45,000 bridges across the United States are currently classified as structurally deficient, and 1/5 of the nation's highways are in poor condition. The economic cost of these systemic inefficiencies manifests as persistent logistical delays, which are further exacerbated by the record-high diesel prices recorded in major shipping hubs like Chicago and Los Angeles this summer. The fatal mistake made by planners was treating global stability as a permanent default setting rather than a temporary geopolitical condition. By designing a domestic economy that functions exclusively on the assumption of frictionless, low-cost global transport, the United States left itself with zero strategic redundancy. The drawing down of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to levels not seen since August 1983 is the direct consequence of this lack of redundancy. It represents the literal exhaustion of the emergency reserves built by a previous generation to insulate the public from the exact supply disruptions currently unfolding across the globe. The convergence of these structural vulnerabilities has manifested as an active domestic crisis, characterized by a direct confrontation between regional jurisdictions and centralized federal authority. As the strategic and economic realities of the 2026 energy deficit intensify, the structural friction between state-level administrative bodies and Washington has reached an unprecedented operational impasse. The primary point of friction centers on the allocation and distribution of remaining domestic energy reserves. On April 12, 2026, the governors of Texas, Louisiana, and North Dakota signed a joint regional security pact, establishing the Gulf Coast and Plains Energy Coalition. This administrative alliance issued an executive directive instructing state-regulated drilling operators to prioritize regional refining and distribution networks over interstate delivery mandates. The coalition cited the legal principle of state sovereignty during resource emergencies, effectively threatening to restrict the flow of crude oil and natural gas to the Northeast and West Coast processing grids if domestic fuel shortages crossed specific mathematical thresholds. The federal response was immediate but legally contested. The Department of Justice filed a series of injunctions in federal courts, arguing that state-level intervention in interstate energy transport constitutes a direct violation of the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution. The Department of Energy simultaneously attempted to seize regional pipeline hubs in Oklahoma and Texas to enforce federal distribution quotas. However, enforcement has stalled due to local bureaucratic non-compliance and tactical pushback from state law enforcement agencies, creating an operational gridlock that has frozen long-term infrastructure planning. This administrative conflict is unfolding against a background of severe municipal and industrial strain. The domestic transportation sector, which relies on diesel fuel for 98% of its heavy freight distribution, has entered a phase of structural contraction. According to the American Trucking Association's Q2 2026 report, over 14,000 independent logistical firms have filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection since the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The remaining national carriers have instituted a mandatory 35% fuel surcharge on all interstate shipments, directly inflating the cost of basic consumer goods. The retail sector reflects this logistical pressure. Major national grocery distribution networks have transitioned to an allocation-based delivery model, reducing inventory shipments to urban centers by 22% to conserve diesel reserves. In response, municipal authorities in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia implemented emergency food and fuel distribution frameworks in June 2026, limiting individual consumer purchases of non-perishable staples and regulating the operational hours of commercial retail centers. Simultaneously, the financial systems supporting corporate operations are experiencing high structural strain. The combination of sustained 23.79% credit card interest rates and escalating operational costs has triggered an absolute credit contraction. Federal Reserve data indicates that small business commercial lending volume decreased by 41% in the first half of 2026. Commercial banks, facing rising default rates on existing retail and industrial loans, have increased collateral requirements, making it impossible for mid-sized manufacturers to secure the short-term credit needed to purchase raw materials or fund payroll obligations. The crisis has also accelerated structural fractures within the domestic energy sector itself. While major multinational energy corporations continue to report substantial nominal revenues from international operations, domestic exploration and production firms are facing capital insolvency. The cost of drilling materials, specialized labor, and regulatory compliance has outpaced the domestic spot price of crude oil, which remains decoupled from international benchmarks due to federal emergency price caps. This market distortion has caused a 34% drop in active domestic drilling rigs, completely undermining the federal policy of accelerating domestic extraction to offset foreign losses. The environmental and regulatory framework of the country has similarly collapsed into an arena of political warfare. To mitigate the energy shortage, the federal administration signed an executive order on May 5, 2026, suspending key provisions of the Clean Air Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. This directive authorized coal-fired power facilities to operate at maximum capacity without emissions caps and permitted the immediate construction of unmapped pipelines across protected federal lands. This move triggered a wave of litigation from environmental coalitions and coastal state governments. Alongside localized physical actions, in the Pacific Northwest and New England, regional activist networks have organized systemic blockades of rail lines transporting coal and shale oil, resulting in over 3,000 arrests and causing persistent disruptions to the national rail grid. The tension has reached an absolute dead end because the fundamental mechanism of global settlement is failing. The international banking system is actively accommodating transactions executed outside the traditional clearinghouses of Western finance. The SWIFT network, which historically processed over 80% of cross-border financial data, has documented a steady migration of global liquidity toward parallel architectures. The immediate result inside the United States is an absolute breakdown of institutional trust. The disconnect between official government documentation, which continues to assert that the economy is experiencing a temporary technical adjustment, and the tangible reality of food lines, localized fuel rationing, and structural business failures has created a profound crisis of institutional legitimacy. The analytical tension is no longer about whether the systems can self-correct. It is about how long the remaining administrative infrastructure can withstand the parallel pressures of local resistance, credit insolvency, and global isolation.